Hello and welcome to week 6 of Econ. I did a kind of a no-frills production today. I didn't even bother to turn the light on, and I'm using the ambient audio here on the iPad. I've got had a long interview today with the Edmonds brothers, the football players, for something that they're doing this weekend. And tomorrow we actually, weather willing, have a football game for GW in the spring. It's a wacky time, so kind of strapped for time, but I did find time, of course, to read the Econ lesson this week. Yes, your teacher does care enough to make the effort to actually read the dadgum lesson. So here we are. And the lesson this week is about markets. It's neat in that the little opening paragraph that the book uses to describe this unit called markets is a very good, concise description. This is some good writing here, and I'll read it verbatim and kind of let you soak it in because we'll be following up on this as we go along. A market is any context in which a seller offers products and services and buyers purchase them. Markets define the extent of freedom in an economy. Markets enable sellers and buyers to compete. The laws of supply and demand in markets determine the allocation of resources and establish prices for goods and services. Buyers and sellers can affect competition through actions like sellers forming a cartel or buyers organizing a boycott. Prices are a powerful factor in the market. Markets are always changing because the goods and services that sellers offer change and because consumer choices change. Markets fail when they do not allocate resources efficiently. That's a very good wrap-up on what we're going to be talking about here. As we look into things, there's going to be a lot of terms this week. A few of them I do want you to remember. Others are not quite as important, and I'll let you know which ones. But this is another one of those things you can really get lost in the weeds quickly here if you want to, because as we said, an economy is not a simple thing. It is a billion variables. No one person has the knowledge of everything. But again, you get an idea with some of these terms that are crucial, just how complicated this is, but in general, how it works, how it's supposed to work. As a matter of fact, the title of the first lesson in this unit is called How Markets Work. It asks the questions that we will struggle with forever. How should a society distribute bread among the people? How about health care? If someone can't afford bread or health care, what do you do then? Since economics is the study of production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services, and since everyone cannot have everything that they want, societies create formal or informal methods of distributing these goods. Some of them use majority rule, where the majority decides who gets what. There are those that use force, where a small group with guns or the best weaponry or the biggest muscles determine who gets what. Under the first-come, first-served system, those with physical or mental limitations are out of luck. Some rely on about a lottery system. Of course, that's just pure luck. Why would you even bother to try then if you got the same chance of getting the same amount of goods? There are, of course, societies that where goods and resources are distributed by government mandate. And, of course, there are the societies where it's governed by a price system. Producers set prices for the goods and services they want to offer. Buyers who have the ability to pay will purchase them. That's the one we use. The price system is the one that is employed most often in the world, or at least variations of it, and quite simply, it is the most moral, it is the fairest, it is the one that is most likely to produce a good outcome. No method is perfect because we are imperfect. The best method of distribution that helps the most people is clearly the price system. That's what we're going to be talking about. The dynamic that makes a free market work is our old buddy, and we're going to talk about this a lot today, supply and demand. The chief factor in creating supply and demand is the prices at which you set for offering these goods and services. Again, a market, broad definition, is anywhere, any circumstance where sellers offer goods and services and buyers purchase them. Markets are different. Wall Street is different than your Saturday morning farmer's market, but they are both markets. Some markets involve face-to-face transitions. Some involve the buyer and seller never seeing each other, coming close to seeing each other. There are some individual markets, of course, and sometimes, and again, just to take a step back here, market is one of those words that has been used so ubiquitously and so freely over time, it's almost lost meaning. A lot of times when we hear about markets, it's the farm market, the cell phone market, the housing market, things like that. These are individual markets, and they are markets, but again, the definition of a market is a little broader than that. Every market has some kind of a structure, the way that they operate. The markets are interrelated. It's not doesn't take you too much imagination to see that a disruption in the oil industry, where oil prices go up, means other things go up, because we all rely on transportation, and when it costs 10% more to transport your goods from A to B, you're going to have to make up the difference somehow. We can define goods in several ways, and again, this is going to be just sort of for FYI. There's capital goods, things like machinery where you make an investment for. There's producer goods, the tools and the raw materials that you use to make these products. Consumer goods are the end purchases. When you buy the jar of peanut butter, that is, you're purchasing a consumer good. Now, consumer goods can be divided even further. There's durable goods, things that last for a long time. Cars, refrigerators, homes. Non-durable goods are those that are easily consumable. Clothing, a candy bar. Short-term satisfaction is there, but they all fall under the item of consumer goods. We buy them, we consume them. Markets accomplish several things in being markets. And one overriding thing here to remember, you can gauge the amount of economic freedom in a society, in a country, by finding how free the markets are. Usually that's almost a direct indicator of how free those people are politically, socially. How free are your markets? To what degree are your markets controlled by public forces or coerced by military forces in some cases? The freer your market, probably the freer the people are going to be. Markets do the basic allocation of goods and services in a way that most fairly and accurately reflects what you value. Goods are distributed based upon what people want. Simple. In other words, a free market provides sellers a way to sell what they want to offer, and a buyer to buy what they want to offer. People sometimes call a market economy a consumer economy, consumer-driven economy, because it's the consumer's demands which often drive it, and that's true. But another driver is the availability of those goods. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Markets determine the amount of goods that are produced and the prices that are charged for these units. There's no bureaucrat sitting in Washington, thank God, that is, or in a state capital deciding, say, for how many toy stores can open, for instance. Bureaucrats don't make those kinds of decisions in America. They do in North Korea. In a market economy, what determines that is what the market will bear, or what producers think it will bear. Whether there are enough available consumers to have a toy market in the first place, and maybe more than one, maybe 10, maybe 1,000, based on the market. It's not determined by the government. It's determined by what the producers think the market can bear. If computers cost more than what you're willing and able to pay for them, then there will be fewer computers produced. It's as simple as that. The cornerstone of a free market is competition. Everything relies on that to some degree. I'll explain here. There's a term called perfect competition for the point where there are just as many buyers and sellers, and where each individual seller and buyer has really a negligible impact on the price. That is not a term I need you to remember, but suffice to say that this is a symbiotic type relationship. There's a reason for that. Sellers compete in different ways: price, quality, product design, variety, customer service, advertising effectiveness. If Company A produces widgets for 49 cents each and Company B will try to sell them for 48. Maybe they'll use less expensive materials. Maybe they'll pay their workers a little less, whatever. They're going to try to get an edge on Company A. And if they do, then Company A is obligated to do something else to make their products, their widgets, more enticing to you. Several factors affect the amount or level of competition in a market. The size of the market, how many people there are to buy them, the information that people can get before they purchase your goods, mixing and matching, price shopping, comparison shopping, what have you. Competition is crucial. Competition motivates suppliers, companies, to improve their product quality and availability and to offer superior customer service, greater productivity, and the lowest price that they can possibly get away with. Again, gas stations. If there's so many gas stations in Danville, for instance, that you'll never see one that charges a whole lot more or a whole lot less. Yeah, people go to Sam's or what's that one on Mount Cross there? That's they buy in volume so they can offer it a few cents cheaper. Murphy's. Yeah, you might save a few cents there, but this is not going to be a 40-cent difference in gallon of gas. It's too much competition. The idea is, and we'll kind of get into the flowers and rainbows part of this, competition fosters economic growth. It is the most effective way to do that. If your widgets become more popular, more people will want to get into the widget business, build new factories, employ more workers, and so of course the enlightened self-interest of these suppliers producing items that people want lead to more choices being available. Markets enable this dynamic to happen, and they do it most efficiently. A command economy is that is. Communism, whatever, is not built on the principle of competition. But the funny thing happens in a command economy. There will be competition. It's called a black market. It's called illegal goods. Why? Because human spirit. What's Uncle Chuck, Teacher Chuck's favorite saying? In the battle between law and appetite, always bet on appetite. Appetite will win. Capitalism rewards this. Command economies punish this. That's human nature. Now, there are ways that this concept of competition can be corrupted. Collusion is one. We usually hear that in a political context, but collusion is a secret cooperation amongst suppliers to keep their prices artificially high. That's illegal, but it's a very difficult thing to prove in a court of law. Cartels are another way. This is a group of buyers that engage in collusion, basically. OPEC is a cartel. It's legal because there's no international laws against cartels, but basically the Arab oil-producing countries got together and formed a group, and they collectively decide, okay, this is where we're going to set all of our oil prices here to try to maximize ourselves. Two things problem with that. Number one, Canada. Number two, U.S., we all produce a lot of that, so OPEC's clout is diminishing. Plus, they have rogue nations all the time. Venezuela goes against their wishes and says, well, I'm going to make a little money doing this. Anyway, OPEC's a cartel. It's a legal cartel. Another, on the flip side, the way that competition can be switched around is from Iran, the boycott. Boycotts are legal as long as they're voluntary and nonviolent. The right to buy, of course, includes the right not to buy. Part of the power we have as a consumer. The most famous boycott, probably the Montgomery bus boycott. This was a social boycott. Rosa Parks, in front of the bus and all that. What happened after she was arrested was African Americans boycotted the Montgomery bus system. Well, their proceeds went down really quick, and they made some changes really quick. Money talks. There are also there are the perpetual concerns from some that common charges that these free markets exploit poor people. The idea is that it drives down the wages for the workers, and the workers subsequently don't have enough to buy stuff. And there's a grain of truth in that insofar as one of the ways that a business can keep their overhead costs down is by paying workers as little as they can get away with. That's true. It's for a lot of businesses, overhead personnel is going to be their number one expense. However, when you have competition, healthy competition, then Company A can't pay you $10 an hour if Company B over here is offering you $15 an hour. Where are the good workers going to go? They're going to go to Company B. Company A finds out they're stuck with a bunch of stiffs. They have a hard time hiring anyone with an IQ above room temperature. Well, we're going to have to pay them a little bit more. That's competition. Competition creates that pressure. And the numbers show it. The United States has practically eliminated what's called sub-living economy. That is to say, non-subsistence, where you simply cannot survive. We didn't do that with command economy. We did that with capitalism. Let's talk about supply and demand. This is the cornerstone of a free market. It's the cornerstone of a lot of things when you think about it. Again, supply is the amount of a product or a service that is available for purchase at any given time. There's lots of factors we consider when we look at the supply. The price of the product, how much does a substitute good cost? How much money do I have left over to buy this? Is it a necessity or a nicety? Big difference there. The law of supply states that all else being constant, the price for a product or service, as it increases, the production will increase too. I'm not going to get too much into what's called the quantity theory because, quite frankly, your book seems to like it a lot, but quite frankly, the opposite is quite often true in this weird, wacky thing we call an economy. On the flip side of supply is demand, the total amount of a product or service that consumers are willing to purchase at a given price. Lots of factors go into demand. The price, again, being number one. Again, how much does a substitute good cost? Can I afford the cost cutter brand of bread as opposed to this bread? Is there a difference? A reasonable level of again, complementary goods. That is to say, if you buy one thing, you have to buy another to go along with it. So a lot of things go into effect. Governmental policies, tax policies in particular, also influence demand quite a bit. The law of demand states that all things being equal, when the price of a good or a service goes up, demand goes down. And when prices fall, the demand goes up. I think that's the scenario we're used to dealing with the most. The law of demand is probably the more accurate of the two. Very quickly, this is not that important, but there is something to be said. 4 kinds of goods. Normal goods, when the demand rises, when the income rises, people generally want more of them. Inferior goods are goods for which demand rises as your income falls. Substitute goods, just what you think it is, things, the generic brands, and complementary goods, products that are complementary to what you purchase. If there's a decrease in the price of spaghetti, more people are going to buy spaghetti, and more people are also going to buy ragu or whatever. That's a complementary thing. In a free market, sellers determine the supply and buyers determine the demand. That makes sense. When the price is too high, suppliers will end up with a surplus, an excess, because consumers don't want to pay that much or cannot pay that much for their product. The price for a product or service is too low, then what happens? Instead of a surplus, you have a shortage, because the excess demand is greater than the supplier's willingness or ability to produce the goods. The conflicting principles that we look at with supply and demand are suppliers tend to offer more when prices are high, but consumers tend to buy more when the prices are low. That's true about 95% of the time. Another thing, the law of supply and demand states that the price of a product or service adjusts to bring supply and demand into balance. Remember last week when we talked about the sweet spot? There is a word for this. I always called it the sweet spot. This is called the equilibrium price or market clearing price. I'll explain it to you here. Hopefully by now I've got a nice little graph to go along with this. But this is the sweet spot where buyer behavior changes. Let's say, use widget again, you have a certain demand for a widget. At $20, you're willing to buy it. At $25, you're slightly less likely to buy it. At $30, you're 90% less likely to buy it. Let's take it in the opposite direction. If it's $15, there's a better than 100% chance. If it's $5, automatic. Again, that sweet spot right in the middle, where you are most likely, the highest price at which you are most likely to buy their product, that is the sweet spot, that is equilibrium, that is the spot at which consumer attitudes change. Now everybody's different, everybody's got a different sweet spot, equilibrium point, but everybody has one, and it's different for different products. People spend their entire lives and fortunes trying to determine that sweet spot, and once you get it, it moves. Why? Because economies are always changing. Chicken or the egg, which comes first, supply or demand? The answer is yes. They're both important. It can happen both ways. We have seen in history a lot of people investing in great ideas that they think is going to take over the market, and nothing happens, and they lose a lot of money. They built up a big supply before the demand, and the demand never came. The opposite can happen too. The person at 3M who invented the Post-it note thought it was a failure at first because it was not sticky enough. They were looking for something stickier. So this formula sat around for a while until somebody said, you know, I want to practice. And it was perfect. And the demand grew because of that. It's kind of the flip situation, but remember that as the Post-it note theory. Demand can be created quickly. The most likely scenario, though, is that producers respond to a demand or a perceived demand from us, the consumers. The increase in the number of women working outside the home led to an increase in the demand for maid services. You know, there were no maid services in the 50s and 60s because the large percentage of homes had a stay-at-home parent, usually the mom. That changed. As society changed, the economy changed to go along with it. In World War II, the first rudimentary computers were used to calculate artillery trajectories and things like that. Computer speed increased slightly through the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. Wait a minute. In the 70s, what happened? Customers found that they could use this thing to do a lot of things. As the consumer interest and demand increased, that research and development meant that computer speeds increased, and it has gone up nothing but exponentially since then. It has not slowed down. It has picked up. When the government was primarily in charge of that technology, the advancement, the improvements of that technology were slow. Again, governments are poor agents for positive economic change. What brought the computer industry into orbit was consumer demand, the free market. It works. A couple of things here as we look more at supply and demand. Keynesian economic theory emphasizes demand. Basically, demand determines the amount supplied. Keynesian is a little bit more over here towards the command economy. It believes in relief payments to consumers to be able to purchase goods. The idea is if the public, the government, puts money in people's hands, people will spend more money, and that will boost the economy. That will stimulate the economy. Stimulating demand or stimulating production might sound like two sides of the same coin, but the difference it makes is huge. The idea that government should encourage an increase in production, which will then lead to strong demand upon consumers, is a fallacy a lot of times. Yes, it can work up to a point, but that price point is very quick. Again, the money's not free. Okay? That's the bottom line. People tend to forget that. The money is not free. Unit 28, or Lesson 28, is simply called How Much Does It Cost? It starts with a great quote from Henry David Thoreau. The price of anything is the amount of life you exchange for it. Usually we associate handing money out for a product, but that's part of you. That's part of your life was spent earning that money. So you're swapping out part of your life to pay for a product. How much does it cost? Well, how much is it worth to you? That is a great question. That is another one of those questions that economists try to figure out. At what point is something no longer worth it to you, Mr. Consumer, and to you and a billion others? Everyone is a little different, and they're trying to sell the most they can at the highest price they can get away with, and of course our demand is going to make them sell it for the lowest that we can get away with. Price, of course, is one of the main influencers. You could say the main influencer of supply and demand. Supplies vary directly with price. Goods that do not command a price that generates a profit for the supplier don't get made. If they're not going to make any money, they're not going to produce it, or at least they think they're not going to make any money. Price determines who's able to have the goods and services, who can afford it. It affects our buying habits. It is the most efficient way to allocate these resources. It is much more efficient than somebody trying in a bureaucratic office trying to decide who gets what and how much. Prices that influence a free market, far and away the fairest way to do that. And again, as we mentioned earlier, one of the biggest factors in pricing is competition. Everything has a price. Everything. The price for money is called interest. The price for labor is wages and salaries. Everything has a price. Granddaddy, the old country saying was, it's a nickel for the fiddler. That is to say, you don't get it for free. You got to pay them. We mix up the concept of price and cost sometimes, but in reality, they are a different thing. In economics, price is what a consumer pays for a product or service. Cost refers usually to the cost of production, just so you know. Markets, all of our behavior determine those prices. Buyers, of course, us, we want the lowest possible price possible. The sellers want the highest possible price, the highest that they can get away with. That's pressure. Those are not competing things. They're actually more complementary, and it does work. The minimum price it can charge to make production worthwhile is what the minimum that a company will charge. Let's say a producer of candy bars decides all of a sudden this is a gourmet candy bar, and instead of 50 cents, you got to pay $5 for it. Does it work? Is it worth it to you to spend the extra $4 on a candy bar because you think it's gourmet? If you really like it. Again, is it worth it? That question we ask ourselves over and over and over about more than just consumer goods, about sometimes life itself. Is it worth it? Is it worth it? We make that decision 1,000 times every day, and it is the lifeblood decision of a free market economy. Is it worth it? Couple of things here very quickly. The difference between a price maker and a price taker. A price maker is a producer who has enough influence in the market to have an input to where it doesn't really matter what they charge. Rolls-Royce is a price maker. They can basically charge more or less within reason whatever they want, because it is that rare group of products where if you have to ask how much it is, you probably can't afford it. Most others fall under very, very different sets of rules. The concept of a relative price, the price of one product or service expressed as the price for another. An economist might say that the relative price of an apple is 2 potatoes. Well, relative prices show us the value that one product or service has compared to another. Relative prices also, and this is an important concept, measuring the relative scarcity of goods and services. So far, we've talked about goods and services being pretty well abundant. If you want it, you can find it, you can get it. The best example of this are the fees that medical specialists charge us. The old joke is, what's the difference between a dentist and an orthodontist? About $20,000 a year. The orthodontist offers specialized services. The orthodontist has to have additional training. They have to have more education. Therefore, they are going to have to charge more money to recoup their investment in this highly specialized service that they provide. A service that is less available than the one offered by the dentist. That's relative price. Relative price. I repeated it. That means remember it. A lot of what we've been able to accomplish in America is the pressure from the consumer, which keeps businesses honest. They, except in a very few other cases, have to offer the lowest price possible. Why? There's somebody else over here making a better mousetrap, and they're selling it for 10% less. That's competition. Who wins? We do. We being the consumers, and largely we in America. The innovations that American businesses have had have come through this competition, through this consumer demand for products at the lowest price possible. Henry Ford developed the assembly line production of automobiles and cars and trucks before 1920. Cars were primarily playthings for the rich. The average Joe did not have a car. Using the production line system, physically, Ford's plants were able to produce more cars per year. Instead of 1,000, they could produce 15,000. And there's only so many rich people to buy cars, so the price per car, the average cost it makes to produce each car, went down precipitously. They have more cars. What happened? The price went down. So more average Joes could buy cars. And as technology increased and they could produce more for comparatively fewer dollars, more cars were produced and the price went down. This has happened today. It is happening on almost certainly the device you're watching me on, be it an iPhone, an Android, an iPad, a laptop, a desktop computer. Customer demand has made computer technology grow by leaps and bounds. It is amazing to me. I'm not an ancient guy, despite what you think. I'm 53 years old. I went to college in 1985. At that time, I bought a computer as a freshman that cost $2,000. Imagine what you can get now computer-wise for $2,000. And if you want to extrapolate it into 1985 money, that's like spending almost the equivalent of four. It's about double this since inflation. We'll talk about that more. That would be the equivalent. What kind of computer today would you spend $4,000 on? That's, what, 8 iPhones? And, this too, in 1985, I had about 1/1,000,000th of the computing power that you have in your iPhone. It was an 8088 portable computer, and yes, it was portable if you were an Olympic weightlifter. Daggum thing weighed about 75 pounds. Screen was this big, and it came in 2 colors, black and not black. You had 2 little floppy 5 1/4 discs that each held 64K of information. K, kilobytes. So, here we are, a generation later, 30 plus years later. Yes, it's been a long time. But here we are, and the computer cost about 1/4 of what it did in 85, and it can do 1,000,000 times more things. That's capitalism. That's demand. That's the demand that we as customers, as consumers, have placed on this industry. We have demonstrated that we are keenly interested in digital devices and doodads, and we will pay for them. But you have got a lot of competition. People decry Microsoft as a monopoly, and you can make an argument for that. Their operating system is on 90% of the world's computers, but They have stiff competition from Apple. They have stiff competition at all the time from others. And they know that in this dynamic digital business, today's monopoly is tomorrow's nothing. It is constantly changing. So Microsoft, even though they are large and in some ways monopolistic, has made advances. They have been sensitive to consumer demand. They are not behaving like a monopoly in that respect. A true monopoly doesn't have to worry about what you want. They have all of the widgets in the world, and they will sell it at whatever price they want. If you can afford it, fine. If not, well, that's fine. We got others that will. A couple of other things. I'm going a little long here. I love talking about supply and demand in market economies because this is the lifeblood. This is freedom. When we talk about overall freedom, this is freedom. The ability of us as consumers to basically wave our dollar signs in front of a company and say, hey, I'll pay you $25 if you can produce this. Oh, well, now the other company is offering me the same thing for $20. What you going to do about it? We hold the cards in a good, healthy, free market economy. We really do. Price discrimination. Just a quick definition here. That's selling the same product to different customers at different prices. It might seem unfair, but it usually has to do with what we remember that term last week, economies of scale. Selling a widget in Danville, Virginia is going to, you're going to have to lower your price if you're used to selling them in San Francisco or in Manhattan. Different economy of scale here. That happens all the time. There's nothing wrong with that. Museums charge, and amusement parks charge a different rate for children. Things like that. If you're, and this is a great example too, if you're on an airplane, there's a chance that no two people on that airplane paid the same price for their ticket. Why? Well, most of it is the different means of obtaining the ticket and the different motivations. If you're a business traveler, you're not concerned about the cost. Company's paying for that anyway. If you went through an agent to book your flight, you're going to have to pay a little bit more for them, so price is also less important. Others go to Priceline.com or places like that. Everyone had kind of different means or motivations on how to that ticket, and so the airline industry has been very good in adjusting the price to pay for the particular circumstance of that one consumer. Very good. Then we get into the opposite, the command economies and artificial price controls. Prices, remember that our sweet little equilibrium point? This operates on the incredible hubris that government can somehow determine where that sweet spot is all the time. They don't have a chance. People who devote their lives to this, who pay a steep price if they're wrong, are quite often wrong. What the heck kind of chance is someone who pays no price for being wrong, what kind of chances he got or she got of finding the sweet spot? But it still happens. A lot of people, particularly in the command economies, think that artificial price controls keep everything within a sweet minimum. Even in American philosophy, we have this sometimes, rent controls, again, to try to make housing affordable and available. The problem is if you set the rent controls too strictly, then people who have the buildings will just board them up. It's not worth it to them to rent it out because they can only charge so much, and it's just they decide it's not worth it. Price ceilings lead to shortages all the time. It happens. It's amazing. The evidence is ubiquitous. It's out there, but anyway, people still do it because they operate from that fallacy that this time we'll get it right. One thing I do want you to remember, the diamond water paradox. This comes straight from our old buddy Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations. I'll do a little verbatim here. The word value, it is to be observed, has two different meanings, and sometimes expresses the usefulness of some particular object, and sometimes the purchasing power of other goods, which the possession of that object conveys. The one may be called value in use, the other value in exchange. The things which have greatest value in use frequently have little value in exchange, and vice versa. The paradox of value, although water has a greater physical value than diamonds, you can't live without water. Water is absolutely essential for life. Why then are diamonds more valuable than water? Well, there's lots of reasons. The availability. Water is much more available than diamonds. People have to expend less labor to obtain water than they do diamonds. The supply of water exceeds the demand, except in very few instances. And those factors take something that is essential and make it, from a market standpoint, less valuable than something that's not essential for life. This is what I want you to remember. The theory of marginal utility helps explain this. We talked about this last week. Remember, marginal utility is, you like the potato chip, you want more, you want more. At some point, you don't want more. At some point, more is less desirable. The next unit of water is consistently more available than the next unit of diamonds. Supply and demand works again. Prices reflect how people value goods and services. The old saying goes, show me your checkbook and I'll show you where your priorities lie. That is true. Very quickly, man, I get wound up on these things sometimes. When markets change, markets, as we mentioned, are constantly changing goods and services that are available because consumer demand is constantly changing, because technology is constantly changing, because everything is constantly changing. How many objects do we use today that were simply not available 20, 30 years ago? Quite a few. Changes are a form of competition. As things change, companies and consumers have to adapt. The horse and buggy whip industry disappeared when cars, like we said with Henry Ford, became more affordable. There's a great novel written in the mid-60s called An American Tragedy, where civil engineers were replaced by these newfangled computers that were beginning to do things. People who had spent their entire lives working in this industry, producing a product for which there was a demand, all of a sudden they're not there. If you're into old-timey music, John Henry's hammer told the story of a steel-driving man who built railroads who was suddenly made obsolete by a steam drill. All the work he had done, all the times he had swung his hammer in sweat, no substitute for bread and beans, the song goes. All of it became moot because of technology. And we are living in a time when that is more true than it has ever been in human history. The differences in the economy and the available products today and just a generation ago is staggering. Change is difficult, but economies change all the time. And never, I would say, in human history has an economy changed more quickly than the one we have now. In 1955, Forbes published their first list of the 500 top public corporations in the U.S. This year, of those 500, only 61 were still on the list. That's a lot of turnover in a couple of generations. Just like money is not static, it's dynamic, it's constantly changing, the economy more so. An increase in the price of a good or services causes us to look for substitutes. The availability of substitutes makes it a little bit more enticing. We all know that. We have some kinds of what we call static goods. Now, this is important too. There are some things which the laws of supply and demand don't directly apply to. We're talking things like electric services, utilities. It would not be feasible to have 10 different sets of pipelines running, one owned by company A, one by B, one by C. No, there's one pipe that presumably the government or somebody builds, and private companies administer it. Electricity is like that. It wouldn't work for us to have 10,000 lines running across and 50 sets of poles. No, you have one set, the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, and the laws in supply and demand are different there because the supply is naturally limited. And so we have, as an economy and as a people, taken it upon ourselves to allow for more public control over things like that, utilities, lines, infrastructure, where there is that natural limit to things. And of course, these exceptions still play into the economy. If electric rates go up, other things are going to go up to pay for it. There's a whole lot of terms that I'm not going to allow you to, or not going to force you to memorize, in terms of elasticity. That is the degree to which prices change. Suffice to say, it is a lot, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of factors that play into them. One example here. This is called cross-price elasticity of demand. Sounds like a mouthful. It's a measure of how much demand for one product changes because of a price change for another product. When there is a substitute available for a product, demand for the substitute will likely go up when the price of that original product goes up. If that jar of jelly all of a sudden costs 50 cents more, you're going to look at the generic a little more closely. An increase in cable television rates means quite often a decreased demand for satellite TV. An increased demand for satellite TV. If your cable rates are going through the roof, let's look at the dish, honey. It happens all the time. Elasticity of demand shows how much demand changes with regard to your income. That is to say, if you follow on economic times, your choices change, and they are constantly changing. Prices change, motivations change, economic situations change all the time. One I do want you to remember is something called menu cost. It does have to do with a restaurant. How many times have you gone into a restaurant and you looked at the menu and all the prices are listed right there on this beautiful stock paper, and it's nice and color, pictures and everything? Well, let's say all of a sudden they want to change the price of the salmon dinner from $10 to $12. That means we got to buy a whole new set of menus. It's probably not worth it if that's the only thing you're going to do is to charge a couple more bucks for the salmon. Now, at some point, the chicken dinner goes up, the buffalo burger goes up, and then all of a sudden, yeah, it's time to change the menus physically. So, yeah, again, at what point is an expenditure justified? That happens all the time with businesses. It happens all the time in our personal economy. Again, what's our phrase? Is it worth it? Businesses, people, you and I make that decision all the time. Very quickly here, because free markets are administered by humans, because humans participate, they are imperfect, and at times they are going to fail. A couple of the reasons that are almost always behind the failure of free markets. And when we say failure, we mean burps and hiccups. Yes, the Great Depression was terrible. It only lasted a few years out of a country that's been around for 230 plus years. Most of the time, the Great Depression is very much the exception. We talked about monopolies earlier, where they are not sensitive to competition, where they can do what they want. Monopolies are a perversion of all of these wonderful economic theories we've talked about. Everything that we talked about in terms of price setting, our demand, our changing, it's perverted under monopolies. Monopolies don't obey any of these rules. And they are absolute poison for an economy for 1,000 regions. They choke off competition. They lead to a lack of consumer confidence. They do not allocate resources efficiently. It is, again, it makes every economic advantage that we've talked about, all of these wonderful principles which maximize the allocation of resources and goods, makes it moot. Monopolies are illegal in the United States. Again, proving what's a monopoly sometimes can be a little tricky. Is Coca-Cola a monopoly? Well, they have a monopoly on Coca-Cola, but no, there's robust competition in the soda market. We mentioned Microsoft. 90% of new computers have their operating system. Are they a monopoly? Well, not under the standard definition, because they still develop new and more advanced Windows versions, and they have certainly competition in other areas of the market with Apple and others. Couple of words. These are funny words. I want you to remember them, though. Monopolistic competition. Monopolistic, P-O-L-I-S-T-I-C, competition is when several producers offer unique goods and services that, while they're different, they still compete with each other. One example of a market is restaurant market. In a sense, Chili's, Applebee's, Ruby Tuesday each have a monopoly on what they offer, but in another sense, they're all competing for the same customers. But there is competition. It's just within one realm. There's the argument that the federal government has a monopoly on public education. You know, still about 87%, I think at last check, of students attend public schools. Does that amount to a monopoly? Can the government have a monopoly? Yeah, the answer is yes. The government quite often is a monopoly simply because they don't have to play by the same rules we do. And again, they don't get punished, generally speaking, for being wrong. We do. We mentioned earlier about what's called a natural monopoly. That's the utilities. That's the phone lines, the pipelines. That's a natural monopoly insofar as we're not going to dig 18 pipelines or something. There's only going to be one set of pipelines, and now we'll determine who calls the shots there. Cable television for a long time was a natural monopoly. That's less true now, what with satellite services and whatnot. An oligopoly is where you have not a monopoly, but oli means a few. You have a handful of markets there. If your industry is making passenger jets, you've only got a few customers. If your market is producing military aircraft, you got one customer, the government. That's a monospony. M-O-N-O, mono, P-S-O-N-Y. Again, it's a single producer, single buyer. That's where the buyer really has some leverage there. And there are oligopolies. Oligopsonies. A market where there are only a few major buyers, any of which can exert significant influence on the market. Large grocery store chains that purchase ag products in bulk. That's a form of that. Couple of other factors that cause market failure. We mentioned the monopolies. The taxes can cause market failure. Again, that price point. At some point, the taxes cost more than they will ever be worth. Lower unemployment, lower job creation are natural extensions of improper levels of taxation. Externalities, that is to say, industrial pollution, the outcome of a poorly regulated capitalistic system, that can cause failure. When governments don't define or enforce property rights, which, as we mentioned in government, securing those property rights is the number one goal of the government in a free society. When those are not protected and recognized, what happens? The obtaining of property and the value that is created in that process becomes less. That is to say, people stop doing it. Why would you work hard for personal property when it's not going to be protected? Public goods are a reflection of market failure. Private goods are goods that one company or one person owns or consumes. Public goods are goods and services that more than one person uses, public parks and roads and whatnot. Private companies are not going to make a profit if they open up a park unless they can charge money for it. Another part of this, elderly people don't receive a direct benefit from public schools. One other thing here, government can help prevent market failure by keeping the markets competitive, not by protecting monopolies. That has the opposite effect. A couple other things here. I'm going to try to get this in real quick here. I like this example in your book. Imagine living in an economy in which supply is determined not by what producers want to make and not by what consumers want to buy, but by what bureaucrats decide ought to be produced. Where prices are determined not by the market, but what government officials think they should charge. We've just described a command economy, a communistic economy. Again, the world's sum of economic knowledge is divided among 7 billion people. There's no way in heaven that somebody or a group of people at an office can do this accurately. And what does Uncle Chuck say? Never trust someone who pays no price for being wrong. In communist countries, Soviet bloc being the most conspicuous example, what happened was the government planners feared punishment. They had no motivation to change anything. If they changed something and it failed, that's when they paid. So what did they do? Make it the same. Yeah. It's going to be the same now, same as ever. Some industries ended up having a surplus, others couldn't make enough. Well, we've always done it this way, and until the bosses tell me otherwise. Here's a great example. In Poland, shirt factories got a quota for the number of shirts that the bureaucrats expected them to produce, and they gave them a certain amount of cloth to make those shirts. Everybody got the same amount of cloth. Well, as a result, the shirts they made were all small because they could make more of them. And they could meet that quota more easily. That's great, unless you're like me and need an XX large. But no, because they were given a finite amount of cloth and instructions to make this many, they made them as small as possible so they could more easily meet the quota. That is the command economy at work, and it stinks. And that's why we don't have it. I'm going to stop right there. I'm just going to end up going and talking. I've talked for an hour nonstop, and I think I could talk another hour about the wonderful power of a free market economy and the wonderful advances it has made possible. Go capitalism. I'll see you on Monday.